Great. Well, hello everyone again. Welcome to the second session of Module 7, Community Organising. This is the final session of Guardians of the Forest. It's been such a huge privilege to be joined by you all on this 3-month journey, and thank you for all the energy you brought to the live sessions, for your participation in the course platform. It's been a huge privilege to have played a role in bringing the course together. Over the last 3 months, we've been joined by 40 different teachers and 300 participants from at least 48 different countries, which is so amazing, and really hope that everyone's felt inspired and also empowered, and that there might be some avenues for action. One of the difficulties with online learning, or just learning in general, is we've taken so much information, and then what can we do with that information? So I hope that on this journey you've been finding things that particularly resonated, whether it's in the more somatic side or the more practical side or the legal side, if that's something, and a particular avenue that you'd love to continue to follow. And want to remind as well Pablo's amazing spreadsheets that he put together, because that also has so many avenues for further learning. So yeah, maybe Pablo, if you stick that in the chat. And love to hear from you all. If anyone wants to share where they're doing, how they're doing, where they are in the world, the chat box is there. So a small group, there'll be plenty of time for questions and things. So just to keep really active in the chat would be great. So in this module, we've been exploring the power of community and group participation in developing advocacy and conservation work. We've been building on previous work on community-led action for forest care and looked at landmark participatory work defending some of the most endangered forests of India and Sri Lanka. But this week, we shift our focus to what international solidarity can look like, to land justice and community organising efforts in Scotland and Papua New Guinea, and in ways that we can sustain our work more generally. So sadly, Mina Susanna Setra can't attend. So Alastair is going to speak alone, but I'm extremely excited about being joined by Alastair for this final session. And in a way, it's worked out perfectly. Just to share a little anecdotal story about Alastair. Christabel and I met Alastair about 5 years ago. We invited him to speak in London on topics of spiritual activism and how we can re-find our connection with the natural living world. And we were hugely inspired by his work, Christabel in particular. And he came to stay with us for that week, that night. And Christabel had written her dissertation for her master's degree on the Bhagavad Gita as an ecological treatise, and they spoke about it. And also different ideas of Advaita, mystical Christianity, and the many things that I'm sure Alastair will touch on today when you least expect it, just these incredible wisdom. And then afterwards, a few years later, Alastair was doing a lot of writing and research in these ideas, Bhagavad Gita in particular, and was sending Christabel's thesis to all of his, to a couple of his colleagues with her in CC, which was hilarious for her because she was only in her like 20, she was only about 25, and Alastair was one of her biggest inspirations. So that was just very comical from our side. But yeah, so Alastair is a huge pioneer of modern land reform in Scotland. He's been described by the BBC as one of the world's leading environmental campaigners. He helped bring the Isle of Eigg into community ownership. And on the Isle of Harris, he negotiated withdrawal of the world's biggest cement company called Lafarge from a devastating super quarry plan. And then after that, he served unpaid on that company's sustainability stakeholders panel for 10 years. So he really is an example of someone who can create impact, as well as having all of this understanding of the problems. Alastair guest lectures at military staff colleges, most notably the UK Defence Academy, about non-violence. And his books include Soil and Soul, People versus Corporate Power, which is great, Hell and High Water, Climate Change, Hope and the Human Condition, Rekindling Community, and Spiritual Activism, Leadership as Service. More recently, he wrote Poacher's Pilgrimage, an island journey, about a pilgrimage he did between the Isle of Lewis and Harris. And his most recent book, very recently published, is Riders on the Storm, The Climate Crisis and the Survival of Being. I haven't read that yet, but I really want to. It looks brilliant. So Alice is a fellow of the School of Divinity at Edinburgh University and a visiting professor at the College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow. And he does such incredible work. I'll put his website in the chat, and I will hand over to Alastair. So thank you, everyone. And Alastair, if you want to unmute yourself, and I'll spotlight your video.
Hello, everybody. And thank you so much for being here. Let me just get my settings right. I'm putting myself into gallery view. And can I encourage you that if you are comfortable to do so, please have your cameras on, even if you're doing something like in the background or something, that's okay. And the reason for that is that when I'm giving these presentations, it makes it so much more alive if I can actually see you and get a sense of who it is that I'm speaking to. But let's just see if I can figure out how to hide the folks whose cameras aren't on. No, I can't immediately see that just now. Doesn't matter. But anyway, I've got, oh, I can see quite a lot of you now. That's lovely. That's lovely. So just feel comfortable to turn your cameras on or off as I talk. And because Mina isn't going to be with us, I have very quickly rejigged my presentation. I've doubled the length of it to bring in more about Indonesia that I was going to be talking about, and specifically the Papua and West Papua provinces of Indonesia, where I've been involved with work in recent years, as well as earlier work that I was involved with for 4 years when I lived in Papua New Guinea, and which, as you see, did a lot to inspire my work in Scotland. Can I remind you that if the captioning that is switched on is annoying you, go to CC down at the bottom of your screens on my thing, and you can turn it off. But it's just to help my hearing, which is, I've got hearing aids here. And if you're asking a question and I struggle to understand you and perhaps have to ask Ruby to repeat, please don't be offended. It's not you, it's just my bad hearing that might pick you up wrongly, and I sometimes need a bit of help. My friend, I would be tempted to call him, the great Spanish or specifically Catalan theologian, Ramon Panica, whose Gifford lectures given in Edinburgh University in 1990 are published as The Rhythm of Being. Panicaji, who said to us here in Scotland, near where I'm speaking to you from now in Glasgow, he said, I am not half Spanish and half Indian. I am wholly Spanish and wholly Indian. I am not half Christian and half Hindu. I am wholly Christian and wholly Hindu. Panicaci, when he lectured to us here in Glasgow 30 years ago on the theme of agriculture, techniculture, or human culture, began the lecture with the expression, let me begin with prayer. And I have the transcript right here. It was entrusted to me, the transcript of his lecture, which somebody had kindly typed out. And we're talking here today about spiritual activism, the spiritual basis for being active, for being alive in the world. And what struck me a couple of weeks ago when I was handed this text, which in due course I will transcribe properly, is it has many scribbles by the transcriber. And whereas Panicaci had originally said, let me begin with prayer as his very first, I think it was, yes, his very first sentence. The transcriber has inserted, let me begin, the letter A, let me begin with a prayer. And I thought, no, no. When I do the final transcription of this, I will have it as he originally had it. Let me begin with prayer, because I would put it to you as my first point today, that if we are to be activists, spiritually informed, that is not something out there that we do, a prayer that we go out and repeat, but rather it is a state of being that we constantly seek the gift of grounding in. Therefore, let me begin with prayer. Let me invite you into that state of receptivity that connects us beyond the surface level of our ego cells, our small cells like these fingernails in this hand, down to a level of profound interconnection where Atman is Brahman. We are all members one of another, as St. Paul put it, or branches in the vine of life, as Jesus put it. All Muslims are as one body, as one of the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, put it. We are all parts of the goddess, the parthenogenetic goddess, a word from biology, which means basically, if you cut off one bit, it regrows. You can't kill the spirit, for she is like a mountain. On and on. The first noble truth of Buddhism is that suffering is a reality. The subsequent noble truths are about the path of great liberation so that we can be in the world, but not of it. Not caught up in the trappings of the world that entrap us. And I put it to you, friends, and I'm loving seeing your cameras on. I'm seeing somebody knitting, I'm seeing somebody eating. This is wonderful. This brings it alive. This, for me anyway, this brings it, this brings it alive. You note this expression, you are real people in a real place. So if we are going to face that first noble truth, that suffering exists, and if we are going to be participants and recipients of great liberation, what does it mean in terms of how we do our activism? What does it mean specifically for spiritual activism? And what I'm going to share with you today is insights from Scotland and the Melanesian. Melanesian is an ethnic group meaning black-skinned Pacific, basically. The Melanesian parts of Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and what is generally known as Papua or West Papua in the Indonesian part of New Guinea being the second biggest island in the world after Greenland. Let me move to screen sharing. Oh, now it says I'm disabled from screen sharing, Ruby, so could you enable me, please, or make me co-host? That's it. And see if I can find the right one I want to share. There we go. Okay, So here's where I'm based in Glasgow in Scotland. Here is where I grew up in the Outer Hebrides, the Isle of Lewis. Here is Papua New Guinea. In 1977 to 80, I was for 2 years in the Gulf province area, the Kerema region here in the south. And in 84 to 86, I went back again to work with the South Pacific Appropriate Technology Foundation based in the capital city of Port Moresby here. But also since 2012, my wife and I have been invited on a number of occasions to work with both government officials and laterally grassroots community groups in Papua, or more widely known in the world as West Papua here. I have to be a little bit careful with my terminology because this is sensitive work that we're doing here, and it's necessary that I respect the political conventions, which is why you'll hear me speaking technically of Papua province and West Papua province in speaking of Papua here. Now I'm going to share with you two frameworks for what I'm going to be looking at today. First of all, what I think of as being the triune basis of community, that is made up of soil, our connection with the earth, soul, our connection with the deep spirit, the roots of life itself, and society, community with one another. My best known book is called Soil and Soul, and when I wrote it or published it in 2001, before that, when I was writing it, I said to Satish Kumar at Schumacher College, he said, "What's your title?" I said, "Soil and Soul." He said, "Why don't you add a third to that and make it society?" And Satish, for those of you who know him, his most recent book is called Soil, Soul, and Society, in which he develops this triune theme of the fullness of what community means. So, to me, folks, community itself is in essence a spiritual practice, you might say. Community is that membership of one of another, of all being Buddha nature, of Atman, the individual self or soul, ultimately is one with Brahman, the universal. And in that beautiful metaphor from Hinduism, each one of us is a jewel in the net of Indra, the god Indra. Each one of us is a jewel in which all other beings are ultimately reflected. How far we are conscious of that depends on where we are in our spiritual development. So soil, soul, and society. Society, community, as I'm using the word here, being much more than just society in the usual sense, but including these connections. Another framework I'd like to introduce you to that I use a lot in my work is what I call the rubric of regeneration. Namely, that community regeneration, how we rebuild our connections of soil, soul, and society. In my experience, follow the triune pattern, and I learn a lot in this from the liberation theology of Gustavo Gutierrez. Have I got his book here or is it downstairs? Gustavo Gutierrez, the great Brazilian theologian. I don't have him right here, but I beg your pardon, Peruvian, not Brazilian, goodness me. The great Peruvian liberation theologian. There's one of his books there, sharing the words for the liturgical year. He's best known for his book that I've got downstairs, Towards a Theology of Liberation. And you'll find, if you're into that, various textbooks. It would help to have it the right way up. Radical Christian writings, that kind of stuff. And yeah, liberation theology, a reader from Cambridge University Press. I'm just pointing you to these resources for those of you who are interested. But what I've learned from Gutierrez's work in Latin America is that he talks about doing history. He talks about the importance of our history. He talks about what I call here, remembering that which has been dismembered, facing the suffering in that first noble truth. Remembering, meaning bringing back together, bringing to memory, but also to real presence, that which has been dismembered. And Gutierrez says we can only do that when we exercise what biblical scholars call a preferential option for the poor. God's or the divine nature's preferential option for the poor. In other words, it is when we see in solidarity with, and therefore through the eyes of the poor or the broken in nature, that we start to see reality most clearly. Again, that brings us round to our activism. Because what is our activism about if it is not solidarity with the poor and or the broken in nature? So from that, we can revision how the future could be. So once we remember what has been dismembered, we can revision an alternative future for our communities. Without vision, the people perish, said one of the prophets. And then we can reclaim what is needed to bring the change about. Now, I grew up on the Isle of Lewis. My father was a community doctor there. I was born in 1955. And in that community, you grow up close to nature, working with animals, working on the land. And you grow up with friends who are with you for life. So if you notice that friend Alec George Morrison on my left there, who lives in that house over there, I was visiting just last week. There he is as a child. So there we are, that's my sister. That's me when I was about 9 years old, something like that. There's Alex and me as child. There we are as we are now. This is not about Facebook community where you follow or unfollow a friend. This is about community where you have to have a very broad acceptance of one another's differences. You have to be very tolerant of difference. And yet, nevertheless, when the boat needs pulled up from out of the sea, no matter what our differences, we all have to pull on the same rope. So I grew up in a community by the sea. Fishing was an important part of our way of life. And it was only over time that I came to the remembrance of what had happened, because for all that what I'm showing you here looks idyllic, the community at the time when I was growing up was deeply disempowered. And the reason was that the people did not, and in many parts of Scotland still do not, control their own land. And the reason for that is that a powerful class of entrepreneurs, of capitalists had come in and treated land as private property and literally kicked the people out, dispatched them on emigrant ships. I'm talking here in the 18 and 1900s. When you wonder why there were so many Scottish names in the telephone directories of North America or Australia, this is why. The same goes for Ireland. The same will actually go for many other parts of Europe. And in this remembering, it is important to remember our cultural history for reasons that may go deeper than many of us might be aware. What's distinctive about Scotland is how recently people were treated like this. And by people, I mean specifically white people. You see, you'd expect to see a scene, perhaps, of people in a country of the South being treated like that. The point I am making is that in a number of parts of Europe, in fact, in many parts of Europe, when we dig into our history, we too underwent this kind of trauma. And so one of the distinctive features of my work is understanding how the oppressed so easily became the oppressor. And if we don't understand that, we carry on in our same cycles of being oppressor, of being racist or whatever without realizing it, sexist, however, whatever it might be. We carry on being like that without realizing it and without adequately, deeply diagnosing why we are the way we are and how by remembering we can revision an alternative. And so to the creation of this kind of world, a yours and ours world, a world that becomes polarized. You see, once you are the oppressed and you become oppressor, once you are kicked off your land in Scotland and you go to North America, where the only employment is going to be wielding the lash in a slave plantation or killing Native Americans, once you do that to your soul or have that done to your soul becomes cauterized. Do you know that word, cauterized? You know, when you've got a bad wound and if you're bleeding, sometimes they'll take a hot iron and cauterize it to seal it off and stop the loss of blood. But we become emotionally cauterized. And in my view, when we look at somewhere like America or parts of America today, and I'm going to come to this more in a moment, we are looking at a society that has not come to terms with how it got caught up in trauma in multiple parts of Europe. I'm talking about the colonizers here. And how it also became a victim of what it was caught up in. And this is why, as my Native American friends very profoundly understand, the healing that needs to be taking place is not just for the colonized, but also of the colonizer. Otherwise, the colonizer will continue reperpetuating what has happened, the violence that has been carried out through history. There you have it, literally gunboats off the Isle of Skye, a neighboring island to my own island of Lewis, being sent in when the people protested at their treatment. Can you imagine in 1885? I was born in 1955. What's that? You know, there would have been people alive when I was born who were alive when this happened. And it happened in many parts of the islands of Scotland. Gunboats or military being sent in to put down rent strikes, to put down protests. And what's left behind are tumbled stones, like you see here, the people sent away. Let us begin with prayer. School history, because it was not in the interests of the British Empire ongoing to speak of its own crimes. So for me, my process of remembering, of discovery, did not really begin until 1977. when I applied to do voluntary service overseas, and I got sent initially to teach maths and science in Papua New Guinea. Initially to teach maths. My own village, a younger generation of the young women here, Evelyn Cool MacLeod and Catherine Mary McLean. And we are hosting a group of village leaders from West Papua province in Indonesia. And we've come to exchange notes. And we've brought them to this place with these ruins that I showed you a moment ago. Never mind where they've gone now, I've lost them. We brought them here to reflect on colonization and where it leaves us at. We collected shellfish on the shore. We cooked them up in that big yellow pot you see. We shared the shellfish. The Papuans said, this is just what we would do. We would take our honored guests down to the reef and gather shellfish and have a feast. And we cooked them up in this ruins. And then Evelyn, with the fair hair there, as we gathered, she said, it'll be a long time since a meal was had in this house, because this house belonged to one of my great-great-grannies. These ruins were from where her people got kicked around in history. And then while we're there, we reflect on this island woman here called Marianne MacLeod. She emigrated to America in 1930. Two sides of her mother's line were evicted in the clearances, the evictions of the 1820s. They were displaced from their land. They were moved to an area where they experienced multiple mass drownings of their men who had to turn to the fishing to make a living. In the First World War, the community lost 1 in 6 of its young men. A further 200 were lost when a ship ran aground, bringing them back from the war in 1919. They were then hit by both the Spanish flu and the tuberculosis, which, unlike COVID today, hit the younger people more than the older people. And then mass emigration in the 1920s. In 1923 alone, from an island of 30,000 people, 1,000 emigrated to North America, most of them young men. So who is she going to marry? I grew up in a world where many older women were unmarried because of this history, and many were dressed in black because they were widowed, if not in the First World War, by the Second World War. Intergenerational trauma. So Marianne, at the age of 17, sailed to New York, where she married a man called Frederick Christ Trump, and there's her son, Donald. There she is when she's become a wealthy woman. There's Donald Trump. We want to understand the psychohistory, the psychological history of powerful forces in the world. And I asked not just what happened to Donald Trump, but what happened to the evangelical, often self-identifying as Scots-Irish constituency from which he draws a lot of his, or drew a lot of his power. He came back to the island to visit his relatives. These are people I know from growing up amongst them, or recognize from growing up amongst them. He came back from the island and spent only 90 seconds inside their house because he wasn't interested in them. He just wanted the photograph. And when a politician like that says we must make America great again, or we must take back control, or whatever it is, I ask the question, what makes you think you're not great? What makes you think you have lost control? And I give thanks, let us continue in prayer. I give thanks for people like this. Margaret Ogameni of the highlands of Papua New Guinea, who was one of the Melanesians who taught me about community, connection to the land, and asked me questions that I couldn't then answer about my own place. Or Andrew Kaolini, the late director of the South Pacific Appropriate Technology Foundation, who first brought the importance of climate change home to me. And there you see him out in the village, barefoot, making a ferrocement water, as a team made a ferrocement water tank here. Or a Lorena stove made out of an oil drum here. And because Mina's not able to be with us, I just want to say a bit about one of our projects here, the Pacific Regional Sustainable Forestry Program. What was happening is that Clearfell companies were coming in. They were hoodwinking the villagers, getting the elders drunk, giving them a lot of money, signing away the forests. And you've literally got malnourished children here in the Solomon Islands playing on the stumps. I took that picture in 1989 when I was briefly back there. Playing on the stumps of their mangroves from where they previously got crabs and other food. And now it's all gone. And so we were involved in setting up the Pacific Regional Sustainable Forestry Program, the thinking behind which was that if village people could use portable sawmills that we were building in Papua New Guinea and be trained in a polycyclic felling system. So you basically divide the land up into 30 units and you harvest just 1 unit a time over 30 years. So by the time you come back, the trees have grown up again. That kind of polycyclic, many cycles felling system. And what this does is it gives an incentive not to sell out to the overseas logging companies. This slide's slightly out of place. I'll just share it with you now. As I say, I had to rather rush with Mina not being able to be here to build these things into my presentation. And just to warn you, in a moment, I'm going to have a pause before I move on to the case study of the Isle of Eigg. And in that pause, I'm going to invite any questions so far. So if you've got questions, just be on standby to ask. But what you've got here is a kind of tool that we were using. This was developed by the Solomon Islands Development Trust to help village people to understand their own cosmology. And so in terms of the language they would use, we've got before white man and after white man in terms of social cosmology, how you see the world. What was the understanding of time, of space like? Space was the village integrated with place. Now space is the town. What was the understanding of time? It was by the seasons and the sun. Now it's the clock and the watch. What was the understanding of knowledge? It was traditional music, the kundu drum there, the bow and arrow. Now it's what comes out of a school or a university. What is the humankind to nature relationship? It was with the forest and the ocean. Now it's logging. And what was the person-to-person dynamic? It was the village sitting in a circle. It's now the authority figure, often a white male authority figure, being mi fa la boss, I am the boss. And so the logging, the destruction of the fisheries, the mining with the Octedi, beg your pardon, the Panguna mine and the civil war that it caused on the Solomon Islands here. And yet, resistance is fertile. As Alice Walker, who wrote, the American author who wrote The Color Purple, said in a a Channel 4 British television interview many years ago, resistance is the secret of possessing joy. Resistance is the secret of possessing joy. Resistance to being, the second noble truth, the attachment. The suffering is caused by our attachment to things. Learning to overcome the attachment. That is the secret of possessing joy. So imagine me, 1984, I come back from my second time in Papua New Guinea. I've been exposed to these people's thinking, people like Bernard Narakobi, who was the leading human rights lawyer and was one of the directors of the South Pacific. He was on the board of the South Pacific Appropriate Technology Foundation. And I wrote out one of his poems, Welcome to the University. The ancient, timeless, eternal University of Melanesia, or any other indigenous part of the world. The village where courses are offered in living. And thanks to these people, I began to wake up to the fact that we too, for all that we had been pushed around in history and indeed become complicit with being pushed around. For all of that, we too had been raised in a place where courses are offered in living. Where am I displays? Yeah, okay. That's me just coming on to liberation theology there. Okay, I'm just going to stop screen sharing for a moment. And bearing in mind my deafness, and so not speaking too quickly if you can help it, would anybody, Ruby, would you like to field unmuting people or whatever, if anybody has got any points they would like to raise at this point?
I'm not seeing any hands up, but I saw Krista in her comment writes about how trauma in Scotland goes back to the witch hunts. Alastair, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, about the witch hunts and maybe traumas that precede that, and how and how you relate to that in particularly in European countries. There's Pat McCabe talks about colonization of the natural wisdom of European countries, which happened through the witch hunts. But then I was reading other people who speak often about other traumas that precede it and that then created the then witch hunts. And so I think it might be interesting if you spoke a little bit about your understanding of that.
I've just unclipped this from my notice board. These are three women who died in the 1970s, and I knew them. My mother knew them to speak to. I didn't know them to speak to. But I saw them many a time. And they lived in traditional Black houses. Now, I just wanted to look, look at the strengths in those women. Look at the strength that is there in spite of everything that has happened. I'm not, by the way, suggesting these are witches. These would be good, staunch Presbyterian women in good standing with the local church and so on. I'm just giving you an idea of the strength that is there. Let us continue with prayer. Isis, Astarte, Diana, Hecate, Demeter, Kali, Inanna. Many of you will know that chorus from the Burning Times song. The figure of how many witches were killed, murdered, brutally murdered across Europe might not be the 9 million in the song. The scholars put it more like the hundreds of thousands, but that in itself is enough to induce a terror. That in itself is enough to hold a whole community in its grip. You know, I think I've left the book downstairs. Let me just see. It's downstairs. I was looking for my copy of John Buchan's novel, Witchwood, a historical novel. And one of the key things is how they torture an old woman and just the atmosphere of terror that that abuse brings about. Next week, I'm going up to the Isle of Skye to take part in an event in which I am involving a young trainee, she's a trainee archivist in Portree, Catherine McPhee, who is from a family of tradition bearers. And in working through the archives, she has just discovered that a woman in the village of a friend of mine, Ian McKinnon, who will also be taking part in this event in the festival in Skye, a woman from his village was brutally tortured by the landlord's agent. She was able to crawl to another house where she died from her injuries. And that history has only just been discovered. Catherine has unpacked it. There was a feature in the West Highland Free Press, the local newspaper there. There was a feature about it not long ago about her archival work on that. If you go on my Twitter thread, you might find, I think I put it into there a while back. And so what you have seen in the era of what I would think of as the era of colonization, so beginning around the 1600s, when the Statutes of Iona were passed, what happened there is that the clan chiefs were kidnapped by King James VI, who became James I of England. The clan chiefs were kidnapped in 1608. They were taken to a lowland prison. They had been tricked on board a ship by telling them they were going to hear a sermon, but instead of hearing the sermon, the anchor was pulled up. Notice the abuse of religion. The abuse of religion to oppress. The anchor was pulled up. They were taken, they were thrown into prisons over the winter, and they were not let out until they agreed to go to the holy island of Iona. Again, the abuse of the sacred, and sign the Statutes of Iona, which destroyed the bardic tradition, the poetic tradition that was outlawed, and also required that the clan chiefs had to be educated not in their native English, not in their native Gaelic, but in the English language, which meant they had to go away for their education. They had to go away to private schools where they got cultivated into the ways of high living, with all its gambling and drinking and warmongering and so on. And then they came back with their minds perverted. And so in terms of the role of the witch persecution, I just see that as another aspect of colonization, but one that was specifically aimed at holding women down. One that was specifically aimed at suppressing that voice. And it's striking, you know, nevertheless, the women's voice remained strong. Hamish Henderson, the great folklorist, in a paper he wrote called The Women of the Glen, points out that where there was resistance to the occupation of the people's land, it was often led by the women. And today was land reform, which I'll be coming to in the second half of my presentation when I speak about Eigg. A lot of the land reform in Scotland is led by empowered women. That's why I keep that picture of these three old women on my notice board here, because they give us strength. Any other question at this stage, or shall I move on?
Sorry, Alastair. I was thinking about that image of the three women. Thank you so much for bringing that to us all. Anna has a question around deforestation in relationship to trauma. Do you want to ask directly, Anna?
Sure. You can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Hello, Alastair.
Hello, Anna.
Scottish ancestry, and so it's really deep and wonderful to hear all your observations. Your observation about Donald Trump is excellent. So, you know, I've reflected on my own family history. Many of them came through Nova Scotia, but pretty quickly planted in upstate New York. Lots of Scottish ancestry up there. And some of them certainly made a living, well, a lot of engineers, a lot of waterworks, but some in timber. And so I've thought a lot about, I could know more about the deforestation of Scotland.
Yeah.
All the trauma you speak of. And then when many of the immigrants come to North America, it's not as deforested, but in those areas, there's not much old growth forest left. So it gets repeated. And I'm curious, with your beautiful observations about trauma and how it carries on, what you might share about. It seems like some of them would have the observation, we're in this new land, we don't want to repeat, we don't want to see the deforestation, but others didn't seem to make that link. So I'd be very curious what you'd have to say regards not reflecting on trauma, I guess.
Well, I'm just, you know, I'm just getting my book, Soil and Soul here, which is the book I'm best known for. And you have it written into the bardic tradition. You have it written into the poems. You have it written into how, at the same time as the forests were destroyed, and Daniel Corkery, who wrote a book called The Hidden Ireland, an Irish scholar, he puts it very clearly. He says the destruction of the bardic tradition, the destruction of the poetic tradition, brought about by the English colonization of Ireland, under Queen Elizabeth I. They went out to get the bards, because, and notice as activist folk, it is the bards, the poets, those who sing songs, those who tell stories. They are the ones who hold the core of the tradition, who anchor the culture. And we can learn from that, because if we want to regenerate the culture, we do it by regenerating the arts. If you go onto if any of you are on Twitter, later on, if you look at my Twitter thread, you'll see just this morning I put out a tweet about a Gaelic term, Cianalas, which means the longing, the yearning for sense of place. And if you follow that tweet through, you will find a video made by people on the Isle of Lewis. And it's talking about the way in which the recovery of the music is leading the regeneration, especially amongst the younger people. And so here we are. The introduction of intensive sheep ranching had consequences that were both social and ecological. Daniel Corkery said of the Irish bard's perspective, quote, the downfall of the Gaelic culture and the downfall of the woods, these two went together. And I comment, to ignore such poetic evidence would be unscholarly, uncultured, and unacceptable. And then Dr. John Mackenzie of Lochmaree wrote in around 1830 or so on, he wrote about how the Highland Glen used to be, when it was grazed by the traditional cattle, was a place full of lovable shrubs and wildflowers, especially orchids. The milk cows never troubled their heads to force through this flowery jungle, laced up with heaps of honeysuckle and crowds of seedling hazel and other native trees and shrubs. And then he says how the sheep came in. These horrid brutes destroyed every wildflower and young seedling, eaten to the ground, so that the offer of £1,000 would not find one of my loved wildflowers. Those who remembered the wooded glen in 1826 and now looked at it would never believe it was the same place. For the sheep could not eat, unless they looked from a distance, because the sheep could not eat up the beautiful hills. And somewhere here, if I've got it here we are. So this is why, you know, we now have in Scotland, since the late 1980s, we've had this wonderful organization, Reforesting Scotland, with its journal here. Here's one, A Green Recovery. There's one on climate, focusing on climate change. Because basically what we're recognizing is that by recovering our environment, we also recover our soul.
Thank you. Thank you, Alastair.
Okay, and I hope that, so, you know, I would say, you know, ecological restoration. And, but one thing I often have to point out, at least here in Scotland, is that often the people who are good at ecology are not so good on the social side. And you can get a division. And especially, you know, rich people and private foundations, they love pumping money into ecological regeneration, but, you know, keep the local people out of it, please, because they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
And yeah, you got the same there, have you?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
There we go. There we go. So when I work with these folks, you know, I say to them, look, folks, it's like we've got Serie Y and Serie X, that up until when was it? Was it when was the Brundtland Commission on Sustainable Development, the UN's Brundtland Commission? I think it was 1989 that it published, in which sustainable development was defined as development that does not compromise, that satisfies the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. And the way that I see it, it's like when I started off in this game, folks, you know, when I graduated in 1977, when I went to Papua New Guinea. And back in those days, you'd have the nature conservationists on one side. And they would often be, you know, middle class, upper class, well-to-do, with lovely estates and what have you. And you had those of us concerned with social development on the other side, often focused more in the cities or in the villages. And they were apart from each other. And what I saw happening in Papua New Guinea during the 1980s, when I was there especially, culminating in the publication of the Brundtland Commission report, was that these two sides started to converge together. And sustainable development is where you attend to both nature and to social needs. And it seems to me the question we are now facing is whether these two continue together, they're a kind of double helix intertwined in an inverted Y shape, or whether, as I sometimes see happening, the two sides take a look at one another and say, we don't like that, and they overshoot. This is what's happening a lot with the debate around rewilding in Scotland just now. Because unfortunately, rewilding has been pushed very strongly by people with a lot of money, wanting their big rewilded private estates, but not doing it with the people. And so we're starting to see an overshoot. Okay, well, that's no good. We've got to make sure that the future is an inverted Y shape and not an X shape. Thanks, Anna, for raising that point.
Excellent.
Ruby, do I carry on with
Yes, please.
part two? If no other hands are up at this stage, let me just. How about do folk want a kind of 1 minute break, or shall I just push on now?
You know what, Alistair? There's one question from Vicky that relates to this, what we're talking about now, and it might be good
please
to
go
answer
for that.
it.
And then, Ruby, should we give them just a quick 1 minute pea stop, as I call it?
Yeah.
Not time for T and P, but time for a pea stop if folk. Would that be a fitting, Ruby?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. But Vicky, would you like to ask the question, or should I?
Yeah, sure. It's basically about if in your history, in your family history, a number of generations before, there may have been some actions of kind of being the oppressors. In my case, it connects to colonialism and a great-great-great-grandfather going out to Sri Lanka and doing a lot to do with rubber plantations. And that must have had a huge shift on the landscape of Sri Lanka. And I don't know all the details of it, but I just wonder, as going down through the generations, what are the rituals that we can do to heal and break the cycles of actions that have gone before?
Beautiful. So basically, you know, if we are white, and I'm using white in a very general sense, meaning of European origin, and of European origin in the sense of being from cultures or subcultures that have been at the top of the pile rather than the bottom of the pile. So if we are relatively privileged white, I think, first of all, it's really important to own that. It's important to own the privilege that has given historically and very often into the present as well. And it's important to understand where that came from. You know, if one's family is wealthy or well educated or whatever, what made it so? Who made it so? And then what's really important is not to deny the realities. Because like it or not, folks, the probability is that all of us are the products of bygone war and rape and oppression. That's just how it is. And if we deny that, we deny, in cultural terms, what Carl Jung, the great psychologist, would call a shadow. We deny the cultural shadow in our own family, in our community. And so, you know, the first insight of depth psychology from Jung, from analytical psychology, is if we have to own our own shit, we have to own our own shadow. I mean, I think this is part of the first noble truth of recognition of suffering, and the second one of suffering being caused by attachment. And you don't detach by pretending the attachment never existed. You detach by coming to understand what gave that attachment traction within you. So how do you do it? You look into your ancestry and you find some ancestors that you're very happy to own, and other ancestors who are an embarrassment because they were slave traders or out in the Far East or whatever. Well, my view is that we've got to bring them all in. I remember the Native American leader, the Ojibwe Walter Brissett, in a spontaneous ceremony that he and I set going at the University of Wisconsin in 1996. And the essence of it was that Walter made we're all in this big hall with 4 doors in an academic seminar. And Walter said, shut the doors, shut the doors, shut the doors, shut the doors. Because we are all inside now. We must all become indigenous to place. Now, one of the things that my wife and I do is that, learning from the Melanesian people we have worked with, you know, they have these spirit houses, House Timbuna. They have the House Timbuna, the spirit houses, which will have, you know, statues and so on of their ancestors, maybe the bones of their ancestors in it. And Viren and I talk about having a House Timbuna up the back of our own minds. And whenever we become aware, Vicky, of a significant figure, it might be a mentor, it might be an ancestor when we become aware of their significance, we'll say to each other, well, we'll put so-and-so into the house Timbuna. We'll put them into the spirit house. We'll put so-and-so into the spirit house. We will let them be visible, for better or for worse, for whatever they stood for. And only then do we fully own what we too have been shaped by. So that would just be one example of a ritual. Metaphorically or in some literal way, perhaps a little shrine or something, creating your own house Timbuna. I'm just looking at the pictures on my, I'm not going to fiddle with my camera settings just now, but you know, on my wall behind me, the photographs, that kind of thing. Ram Dass, the great late American spiritual teacher, Ram Dass would talk about setting out his shrine, and you'll have, you know, Gandhi and Maharishi, and they'll all be on it. And then at a particular time when he made this recording, he'll have Caspar Weinberger, who was in the hawkish American Secretary for State. And he'd have them all in the shrine, and he'd say, hello, Gandhiji. Hello, Maharaji. Hello, Caspar. You see, you bring them in, and that's a compassion. That's where the work of love comes in. And you don't deny what they've done. This is not about sweeping under the carpet. I was out doing stuff in the garden the other day, and I knocked over stuff in the shed. So I ended up sweeping the shed floor. And I thought, where am I going to put all this mess, all this dust? And I threw it underneath the rhubarb bush. And as I did so, the thought came to me, and I said to my wife afterwards, you know what? How did it come to me? When did I just get it back? The trouble with sweeping things under the rhubarb bush is that it has its roots in shit. Well, in that case, you see, you compost the shit. And that's what we've got to do. That's one of my main themes in Soil and Soul, that you don't deny the shit, you compost the shit. If you deny it, it just carries on stinking, and you wonder what the smell is that keeps on coming up the stairs. If you face it, if you say, well, you're there too, then the shit can start to turn to compost. And culturally, as well as individually, that's what we need to do. Okay, shall I push our, oh, sorry, we're going to have a wee break, weren't we? Ruby, how long a break should we give them?
A few minutes, 3 minutes.
Well, it's 15:16 now. Let's resume at 20 past the hour. Yep.
Great.
20 past the hour. Okay. Now, by the way, I see you've been on chat, some of you. I've not been following the chat, but I've been focused on what I've been saying, but I'll just have a skim of the chat during the break. So you can either leave your cameras on or turn them off, but back at 20 past the hour, that's in 3-4 minutes time. The people before it, the spirituality of the people before it all got heavy. So you just turned recording on. That's Gustavo Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation. There's a reader of his work for those of you who might be into the Christian stuff from Orbis books. And then in the Hebridean tradition, the Carmina Gadelica, you know, I opened it at random. There, the new moon, the king of life, making her bright for us, be mine of a good intent towards all who look at her. Be my knee bent down to the queen of loveliness, be my voice raised up to him who made and blessed her. You can see why that kind of spirituality, it's a bit dodgy with the church, but there you are. That was collected from the kind of people I've been talking about in the 19th century by Alexander Carmichael. In terms of which tradition, that's one of the books I've got, Christina Lana, Enemies of God, a scholarly text on the witch discussion. It discusses the relationship of witch beliefs in Scotland to those of other cultures and compares a Scottish witch hunt with that of continental Europe. Based on extensive research at primary sources, emphasis is placed on the broad issues raised by the witch hunt, the beliefs which made it possible, and the changes in religion and society, which encouraged its rise in the 16th century and its decline a little more than a century later. Another name to look out for in that respect is Julian Goodacre. That's a wonderful here edited collection. Sorry, I beg your pardon, it's not an edited collection. It is a wonderful book by Liz Ann Henderson and Edward Cowan, the professor of Scottish history at Glasgow University. And this is a place where professors of history can write about Scottish fairy belief, by which we mean an understanding of the deep imagination or the indigenous unconscious. And that is no small thing in Scotland. This book is over 700 pages long. The Gaelic Otherworld, edited by Ronald Black, now retired from the School of Scottish Studies at Edinburgh University. If you want to find out more about the tradition, that's just a wee bit of it. That's kind of what we've got here. That is what would be buried in many European cultures if you are able to dig deep enough, if it's still there. So, goodness me, we've got 41 people back. I think everybody's returned. I feared I might lose half of you. Let us continue in prayer and understanding that as a state of being, as an attitude of being, as a receptiveness to being. I was raised in a Presbyterian community, a Protestant community. I became a Quaker by conviction, but very open, as you'll see, to interfaith. Ruby and her sister Christabel are heavily into the Bhagavad Gita, and I've got 4 different versions of the Gita behind me because I love that kind of stuff. So although I'm going to talk a lot about Christianity, don't be put off by that, because when you understand it in its mystical sense, in its sense that goes straight to the divine nature, it's all one, in my view, and not to be confused with what religion often twists it into. So let me now share screen again. So we're at the University of Melanesia was the late Bernard Narakobi here. And I just want to say a little bit about liberation theology. So this had you see, folks, when I got sent to Papua New Guinea in 1977 by voluntary service overseas, it was initially to teach maths and science in an experimental school set up by a Catholic mission, by a retired Catholic Archbishop, Virgil Corpus, and 4 Mother Teresa Missionary of Charity nuns. Well, you can imagine that was some culture shock coming from the Presbyterian Isle of Lewis to such a thing. But it was through that I discovered liberation theology. Gutierrez says, to liberate is to give life. To liberate is to give life. When we're talking of great liberation, we're talking about entering into the great life, the life of the soul, the life of our divine nature. And Gutierrez speaks of liberation at 3 levels: a social level, quoting him here, liberation from social situations of oppression and marginalization; the psychological level, and this is what is so, what I'm moving now, that first level, if you like, that first level, there's nothing or little to distinguish that from Marxism. But Marxism and other such analyses are, in my view, too limited because they don't see the deeper levels. So at the deeper level, the psychological level, I've called it, a personal transformation by which we live with profound inner freedom in the face of every kind of servitude. So think, in terms of your activism, and you'll all be so well aware of how limited your powers usually are and how most of our campaigns fail. But how can we live with profound inner freedom? How can, in terms of that second noble truth, by the way, there's 8 noble truths. I only ever remember the first 2. I'm not very clever on these things. I just remember the bits that really speak to me. The second noble truth about craving, attachment, being the cause of suffering. How can we live with profound inner freedom, even in the face of every kind of servitude, where we don't have options in life? And then thirdly, what I've called the spiritual level, liberation from sin, which attacks the deepest root of all servitude. And this is where it gets interesting, because sin is a real turn-off word to many of us. For sin is the breaking of friendship with God and other human beings. Gutierrez says, the breaking of friendship with our divine nature and with other human beings. And so one of the things I do a lot in my theology is I substitute the word violence for sin. And I can tell you that you have a lot of fun with that. If you're talking to evangelical Christians, you can have a lot of fun once you start substituting the word violence for sin and saying it's not so much about what you do or don't do in the bedroom. It's about how you live your life is breaking friendship with reality or not. So that's an essence of liberation theology. And then my late friend Walter Wink here, talking about the powers that be, how we challenge the powers that be by naming the powers, having the courage to speak to the reality of the oppression, saying what the oppression is. Then we can unmask the powers that be. We can reveal why and how they cause oppression. And then we can engage the powers that be. It's a bit like that revisioning, followed by reclaiming. We can wrestle with the nature of the powers. And Walter says the powers are fundamentally good, but the powers are fallen. Power is fallen. Power is corrupted in human hands. So the name of the game in spiritual activism is constant redemption. Now, I see that this is a slide I've used when I speak with the West Papuans, who are a mixture of animist, Christian, and Muslim, Indonesia being a Muslim country. And that's why I've actually, in this version, which I hastily cobbled together because Mira couldn't be with us today, in this version of what you're getting now, I've used the version where I've got a quote from the Quran here. Verily, never will Allah change the condition of a people until they change it themselves, that is, with their own souls. You see how powerful this interfaith work can be, especially when we're working in a multicultural context. Because when I show the West Papuans, including some of their political figures, including some of those from other parts of Indonesia and not just Melanesians, when I talk to them about doing liberation theology that contextualizes the Gospels of Christ in today's world, where the Roman soldiers are armed with guns, not spears. When I talk about that and set it by side respectfully with a verse from the Quran, both the Christians and the Muslims listen and find or can see common cause. These are some of the verses I use. These images are from Argentina, from Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, who won the Nobel Peace Prize back in the 1990s. And he created these Stations of the Cross. So here you see Jesus having his clothes stripped from him in the rainforest, which is being logged. And there you see the dead Brazilian rubber tappers leader, a trade union leader, Chico Mendes. So Mendes has been murdered. The rainforest is being murdered, and Christ is also about to be murdered. You see the power, or you may see the power, of that kind of liberation theology, a theology that liberates. And here I've used another verse from the Quran. So here is Christ leading a march of landless peasants. In the background are the ships of the conquistadors and the factories of globalization. O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes, that you may know each other, not that ye may despise each other. So you see, I'll collect these kind of things. So if I'm making a presentation like this, and if I'm going to be speaking, if there's going to be Muslims present, I will Google my theme and the Quran, and sure enough, same as the Christian Bible, or same as the Bhagavad Gita of Hinduism, you'll get lots of verses come up on various websites, which you can then independently check out. I check them out usually using the Yusuf Ali translation and commentary of the Quran, which was given to me by a Glasgow Muslim friend. Now, as I say, these slides are slightly jumbled because of my having extended it rapidly this afternoon. But here's another one from the Solomon Islands Development Trust, where we're asking, what kind of development are we talking about? We're talking sustainable development, folks. Well, what does what kind in Solomon Islands Pidgin, what kind of development? Now, the word development means de envelope. Envelope, an envelope. De envelope, to unfold the envelope, to open up what is inside. I mean, rather a mess of that, but never mind. It came out of the recycling, so back it goes. So let's reclaim words like this. Let's reclaim a word like development. We're going to use it to mean unfolding the potential of that which is. What kind of development do we want? And again, this is for reflection in village workshops. So you've got the traditional village, and along comes Chainsaw Man with a briefcase saying management plan. Management plan, and he's got the chainsaw. And now you see in the next image, the forests are cut down. The woman's doing all the work. The man is drinking the profits. The house is starting to fall down. And who turns up but Sol Thai? That's a play on Thai Sol, which was the name of a Taiwanese fishing company that was taking the fish of the Solomon Islands at that time. And he's in his briefcase has got the fishing contract for them to sign away their rights to that. So now everybody's moved to a state of destitution, not poverty. Here you had a kind of rich poverty, an honest poverty, if it is poverty. Here you've moved into destitution, which is very different. And now the gold companies come in, and finally you're reduced to accepting world aid. Now, applied liberation theology, this particular project was led by John Rowan, the late John Rowan, who became the cabinet secretary for a brief time in the Solomon Islands but was originally, before he married a local woman, a Roman Catholic priest, very much into one of my mentors in liberation theology. So I've got John Rowan in my spirit house up there. Bless you, John. Thank you for what you gave us there in the spirit house, along with Andrew Cowlini and all the rest of them. The Turkish cartoonist, and so to Scotland. So I'm going to run through this fairly quickly so we've got more time for discussion. In Papua New Guinea, Melanesian people have been saying to me, how much land have you got? Where are your trees? I say, well, we don't have any land. They say, how can you, we thought all you white people were rich. How can you be rich if you have no land? So you see how these seeds were being planted in my mind. And I came back to Scotland in 1986, where my father died. Shortly afterwards, began working for the Centre for Human Ecology at Edinburgh University. And there was agitation going on because as a consequence of Thatcherite, of hard right-wing politics, Thatcherite politics in the UK. The consequence of that, land was again being colonized, people were being pushed off, no more clearances. And one day I was approached by a man called Tom Forsyth, who was a crofter, a small-scale farmer from the Highlands. And he invited me to join 3 of them in setting up a trust to challenge private land ownership. And the focus was to be the island of Eigg, owned by one man. 3,000 hectares of land owned by one man, Keith Schellenberg here, who was an heir and businessman. And he had had to put it on the market because his 3rd wife and him were getting divorced and they needed to split the proceeds to cut the story short. So here's the sales brochure from Knight Frank International, a London posh people's estate agency. And it was originally Nova Scotia-based Vladi Private Islands run by Farhad Vladi. You couldn't make the name up, could you? Vladi Private Islands. And Schellenberg said to me that Eigg was a collector's item. It was too good for the people living there. Remember what I said about the X and the Y, where Schellenberg was kind of an environmentalist, but very much in that way that partly understood and attempted to do things on the social front, but always was him in control. He always had to be in control. And that blocked the people's empowerment. So here is Tom Forsyth, who I think of as a mentor, who came and asked me if I would join in this, and I gave it only a 5% chance of success. Eigg was valued at £3 million. The only way we could possibly buy it and bring it into community ownership would be if somebody very wealthy noticed our campaign and rallied to support. I gave that a very small chance, and yet it seemed so important. Even if we failed, it seemed so important. Now, this is where, and I'm aware of what Ruby and, oh dear, where have I put it? I'm aware of what Ruby and, here we are. I'm aware of what Ruby and Christabel, her sister, are about. This is where the Bhagavad Gita becomes very important. The most sacred text of Hinduism, alongside with the Upanishads. And either of these in the Penguin Classics translation by Juan Mascaro. If you want it for devotional use, make sure you go to Juan Mascaro's version. There is now another one, where have I put it? Here we are. Juan Mascaro's version. This is where the Bhagavad Gita becomes very important. The most sacred text of Hinduism, alongside with the Upanishads. And either of these in the Penguin Classics translation by Juan Mascaro. If you want it for devotional use, make sure you go to Juan Mascaro's version. There is now another one, where have I put it? there is now another translation that is out that's very good for scholarship, but go to Juan Mascaro for the devotional aspect, because his commentaries are so good. His commentaries are so good. Rabindranath Tagore said in a letter to Juan Mascaro, who was from Majorca, one of the Spanish islands, your translation has caught from those great words the inner voice that goes beyond the boundaries of words. And the essence of the Bhagavad Gita is that we should act, but not be bound by our actions, not be attached to the outcomes of our actions. In other words, the teaching of Hinduism, or this aspect of Hinduism, and especially as interpreted by the likes of Mahatma Gandhi, whose translation of the Gita is here with a commentary. See, Gandhi wasn't just doing the political stuff, he was also deeply doing the spiritual stuff. The essence of it is that whatever you act in, you don't do it to take the credit for yourself, but you make it an offering to the divine, an offering to God, the goddess, the Tao, however you understand that deep source of life as love made manifest. And by making it as an offering to the divine, you free yourself from those wheels of karma. You free yourself from being caught up in the consequences of what follows. And that is especially useful, folks, when you're working with areas that are very often going to fail, social causes, environmental causes, where it's maybe only a 5% chance of that. If you can free yourself from trying to control the outcomes, but just doing the right thing, then you engage what Taoist thought speaks of as Wu Wei, W-U-W-E-I, Wu Wei, which is often translated as action through non-action. And Tom named his boat. Tom had a sailing boat, a working sailing boat, not a hobby one, that you would carry sheep in and bags of peat for burning on the fire, you would carry logs in it and so on, that he called the Wu Wei, because in his view, sailing is action through non-action. You point the boat right to the wind, and the processes of life itself carry you forward. The Bhagavad Gita, renouncing the fruits of your action, Wu Wei, or as Jesus put it, act so that the left hand knows not what the right hand does. Do the right thing, follow the path of righteousness. And I was struck the other day when reading a translation of the Upanishads to see that the translator was translating the word Dharma, which in Hinduism and Buddhism means the deep ordering of things, the deep ordering of reality. Translating the word Dharma as righteousness. It then gives you a different take when you read biblical material. And when you think, well, when they're talking about righteousness, they're basically speaking about the Dharma. So Tom came to me and we put together a vision. We were remembering our history. We were remembering what had dismembered the community, that Eigg had once supported 400 people. It now only supported 60 people. Most of them, many of them had been sent to Nova Scotia in the 19th century. Somebody mentioned Nova Scotia earlier. And our task was to work with the people progressively and more yield over to their leadership in developing the vision. So, oh dear, I can't quite read all of that in my thing, but because my screen is hiding part of it. Oh, there we are. When a shoot is grafted onto an established stalk, the green of the shoot must meet the green of the stalk. In other words, life must meet life. In your activism, seek to be a medium by which life can meet life. The green or cambium is the only living and dynamic part of the plant. in the cultivation of human beings, the same dharma, the same righteousness, the same way, the truth, and the life must apply. And so the Eigg Trust aims to be one small step towards the reapplication of this law of Dharma in human culture. You see the vision there. And, you know, to many people, this was a bit off the wall. But to the core people holding this was where the power was coming from. So I cut a long story short. The four of us who founded the trust subsequently stood down. The islanders had elections. They elected their own board here. They re-elected me for continuity. So I carried on as one of the leaders of the land reform campaign, the aim of which was that given that Schellenberg had to sell the island, we were going to try and raise money to buy it out. But not just in any old way. We were going to invoke what we call in Scotland, market spoiling. If a rich person was hoping to buy Eigg as a holiday island paradise, we were going to show that the natives were restless, that there was a little trouble up country, and that this might not be the best place to have your private holiday retreat, and thereby suppress the market valuation. Here is one of the community meetings in 1994. Notice the amount of alcohol on the table. Alcohol, I think it would be fair to say, abuse is common in historically oppressed communities. You see it on every native reservation. I'm speaking to you from Govan in Glasgow, where when I looked at the figures a while back, there was 7 times the rate of alcohol hospital admissions than the average in the UK, not to mention other forms of abuse. And look at the energy in the inner circle here. By the way, notice how the innermost circle is women. The men are a bit more on the outside. And what's going on here is that the previous night, Keith Schellenberg, the landowner, had phoned Sheena here and said to her, tell them that if they continue to have anything more to do with that trust, I will withhold consent for the old folks' sheltered housing. The outcome of that meeting was to put it to the old folks. Will we carry on or will we desist so that we get the sheltered housing? And the old folks unanimously said, you just carry on with what you're doing. Now that is what I call the touch of blessing. The touch of blessing is where something comes in, and notice how it came out of an unpleasant situation here. The touch of blessing is when something comes in that just gives you a whoomph from within. And I would put it to you that as activists, it is our role just both to be aware of when the touch of blessing is given to us, but also when we can confer it, when you can do things with people, when you can encourage people, help them find their voice in ways by which you become the medium of that touch of blessing. Let us begin with prayer. If you begin with prayer, if you sustain yourself in that place of prayer, then that touch of blessing is not coming from your ego. But from the rhythm of being itself. So what then happened? What then happened, you know, remembering, revisioning, reclaiming, naming the powers, unmasking the powers, engaging the powers. In soil, in soul, and in society. So here you've got the elder Angus MacKinnon, who had been pretty chronically alcoholic. But when all of this started happening, would you believe he got himself a girlfriend from one of the visitors and he gave up drinking? It was quite unbelievable. His life started to shift late in his life, shortly before he died. And here he is with the maps out. And he's teaching incomers to the island. Karen from the south of England here, Davy Robertson from a housing scheme in Glasgow, from Easter House in Glasgow originally. He's teaching them the meaning of the Gaelic place names and the stories of the place. So this is how in practice you recover a sense of place, by community revisioning, understanding the meaning, understanding the stories, and having the elders pass on that touch of blessing. The word audit comes from auditory, meaning to hear. What you see going on there is a form of auditing, a community audit that's going on. Here's another of my models here, where place is a very warm word. Place is about nature and culture. If you can begin with a sense of place, of rekindling a sense of place, that gives you a grounding from which you can deepen your sense of identity, of your belonging to place, whether it's a place you're born in or whether it's a place you've come to. From that sense of identity, you carry a sense of values. And that sense of values can drive a sense of responsibilities. You've got head, heart, and hand in here. And that sense of responsibility, the ability to respond, then deepens the sense of place, which is a context of community, which is a context of divine blessing. And so I said to you, I came out of the Presbyterian tradition. Oh dear, I've lost it. Where is it? I must have it out somewhere else. I was looking for it. I mean, the last thing you'd expect me to come up with here, but somewhere knocking around, I've got the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which we were all required to learn by rote in school. And question 8, I think it is how does God manifest his decrees? God manifests God's decrees through the works of creation and providence. And you see, part of what I do in my work, especially when I speak within my own community, part of what I'm doing is whatever the tradition might be, I'm looking for ways I can make these connections with it. God manifests his decrees through the works of creation and providence, providence. Whoa, you can start to trip out when you reflect on that one. And it's very handy, folks, with those evangelical Christians who say it's not about saving the environment, it's about saving our souls. Well, hang on. I thought that God manifested God's decrees through the works of creation and providence. We're not going to go violating that, are we? Or are we, Mr. Trump? So soon we started generating headlines. Schellenberg responded by issuing letters of eviction to the people on the islands he saw as the ringleaders in the trust. 3 of us who were on the island when that happened chartered a fishing boat. It cost us £160. And we got these photographs to the mainland, so they appeared on the front pages of the newspapers on the Monday morning. You see, this is activism with teeth. This is not everything soft and cuddly. This is naming the powers, unmasking the powers, engaging the powers. This is confronting the oppression. At the same time, trying wherever possible to go heavy on the issues, but gentle on the people. And so in Soil and Soul, you'll find I reflect a lot on my relationship with Keith Schellenberg. How at one level, he saw me as a primary cause of overturning what gave him comfort in life. And on the other hand, I'm constantly trying to remember his humanity and to name his abuses of power, but not to be abusive towards him. And to say to him, look, you too can be part of the community if you only stop trying to lord it over the community. So we set the fundraising going. So remember, we're talking about an island valued at 3 million, and we managed to get some of Scotland's best bands, coffee mornings, collections, all kinds of stuff. All proceeds to the Isle of Eigg appeal. This would be 1996, 97, thereabouts. International publicity. The Guardian, a Scottish land rights revolution. Land reform has the potential to be the most radical issue other than devolution for Scotland. And there's the people of Eigg. That was 9th of June, 1997. 3 days later, 12th of June, we succeeded. We raised 1.6 million. That 1.6 million from international publicity came from one huge donation from a mystery woman who gave us £1 million. And the other 600,000 was from 100,000, I think it was, small donations. Incredible. What was it? The average donation was £6. Yeah, so 100,000 small donations. It was incredible. Sackfuls were coming in because this became a cause célèbre. And this set going, or the major aspect of setting going, modern Scottish land reform. The people of Eigg walking ashore on their own island, raising the flag on a newly erected standing stone. The land reform bill, now one of many land reform acts. Now we have 3% of Scotland getting on for 500,000 acres owned by community land trusts. The right-wing press didn't like it. The right-wing press said it seems Zimbabwe and Scotland share, or rather, they quoted Robert Mugabe's official spokesman saying, Zimbabwe and Scotland share the same goals and ambitions when it comes to land reform. Well, yes, we did, except our approach was different. We were not using the power of the gun. We were using, if I speak from my own involvement and Tom Forsyth's involvement, we at least were using spiritual activism. Others who were closely involved would have seen it differently like that. They wouldn't see it in spiritual terms. But to us, it was the spiritual that gave the deepest cohesion and conviction and power. So now you go to Eigg, and it's a paragon of green living. They've even got their own Eigg electricity, an entire grid system that runs on renewables, all kinds of small businesses that people are running. The population's now over 100. Ecological housing that they're able to build. They used to live in caravans and broken down housing. Now look how they're living. The Eigg electricity scheme here was wind, solar, and hydro. generating a system that they distribute amongst themselves. And so when I go with student groups here, there's my wife Veren on the left there. This was quite some years ago, but also with the Papuans. So here we are, there's Camille Dressler, one of the people who was in that photograph you saw with all the beer on the table earlier. There's Ian McKinnon, our former student on the Isle of Skye, with whom I'll be working next week, looking at the recovery and the meaning of the fairy tradition and what that means for community empowerment today. There's Veren, my wife's there. And these are folks, some of them Melanesians, you can see with very dark skin here, and some of them from other parts of Indonesia, but we're introducing them all. There's Maria Latumahina, who is one of the leaders from that part of the world in one of our planning meetings in Glasgow. That's Jan, one of their members of parliament, a Melanesian, meeting with Scottish members of parliament. It's a Scottish parliament here. They're very interested in what's happening in our Scottish politics. That's us out on a croft, a small farm, where we're planting potatoes. I love this picture. That's Siborgili Pradhan and Veren, both associated with the Center for Human Ecology here. And that's Leila, who was the head of the business development unit in West Papua, and she's a Muslim. And, you know, it was just wonderful how all of those women connected cross-culturally. And there's Alec Rumaseb, and Alec has produced various books, including this one, Liberation Theology. He's written it up in Indonesian, or this one based on my wife's work, Veren Nicholas, collaborative leadership. So what we're trying to do here is work within a highly authoritarian structure left over from Dutch colonialism and then the Indonesian dictatorship to introduce these ideas of collaborative leadership and interfaith liberation theology. There we were, you know, they arrived on Easter Sunday and the Christians wanted an Easter service, but I put out a copy of the Quran as well. And so Udu, who's one of the Muslims, he's reading from the Quran in our living room in the house where I'm speaking to you just now. This interfaith appreciation, as I call it. And there we are at the Kalani Stones. And where's Udin? Oh no, he's not in. Udin's not there just now, but one of them basically were away communing with the stones. He was in tears, he was hugging the stones. He couldn't believe that white people would have sacred natural sites like this. And he says, you know, we had this in Papua too, and the missionaries made us destroy it. And I said, well, you need to convert to missionaries. God manifesteth his decrees in the works of creation and providence. So there we go, folks. Let me stop screen sharing now. Just one moment till I move my things around a bit. There we go. That's the case study of Eigg, and you see how these insights from around the world, I mean, you know, Black theology, Cornel West, Black prophetic fire, James Cone, the cross and the lynching tree. Let me just read you the, you know, we're talking here about a recovery of Christianity as well as appreciation of these other faiths. Here's James Cone, his very last page here. We are bound together in America by faith and tragedy. All the hatred we have expressed towards one another cannot destroy the profound mutual love and solidarity that flow deeply between us. A love that empowered Blacks to open their arms, to receive the many whites who were also empowered by the same love of their lives in the Black struggle for freedom. No two people in America have had more violent and loving encounters than Black and white people. We were made brothers and sisters by the blood of the lynching tree, the blood of sexual union, and the blood of the cross of Jesus. No gulf between Blacks and whites is too great to overcome, for our beauty is more enduring than our brutality. If America has the courage to confront the great sin, the great violence, an ongoing legacy of white supremacy with repentance and reparation, there is hope beyond tragedy. Ruby.
So much, Alastair. That was extremely moving to watch and to listen to, and really amazing to hear the case study of Eigg in such detail, and coming from you, who played such a central part. And it can feel so overwhelming when you have local community against big corporation. And it seems that this difference is just getting greater and greater, particularly now. And that these are kind of impossible counterparts. For example, thinking of something close to home and close in terms of time, there's the COP26 coming up in Glasgow. And at COP is the big negotiations taking place. And there's going to be a lot of competing interests from big corporations and government on the one hand, who can put their can often put their activities under a green banner, even when their impact is very, very different, and very, very different to what local communities might be wanting or might need, or what the kind of environment would most benefit from. And I was wondering how you are coming to terms with this increasing divide between corporation and local community, the effects of globalization, and the increasing move towards the digitalization of a lot of the environmental and the direction that a lot of negotiations are going in, which takes power increasingly away from local communities. And how you're feeling about that on the one hand, and also what your thoughts are in regards to COP26. And
yeah. Well, thanks. I mean, my latest book is it's just got into reprint. It's got a different cover now in the reprint. This is a cover: Riders in the Storm, the Climate Crisis and the Survival of Being. And so, this is a book that, I mean, it's being marketed just now as being for COP26, but it's much wider than that, because what it's doing is it's summarizing the current mainstream IPCC science of climate change. You don't need it to be more alarming than that. The mainstream is quite alarming enough without any exaggeration. It's looking at both denial and alarmism in climate change. And then the most important part is the last 3 chapters, where it really rounds on the survival of being. And I've taken that expression, the survival of being, I've taken it from the very last chapter in Raimundo Panicar's book, or rather it's the epilogue. The epilogue there in Panicarji's Gifford Lectures. He says, since delivering the Gifford Lectures 20 years ago, I've hesitated to publish this book because of the last chapter, which was supposed to be titled The Survival of Being. And he talks about the difficulty of wrestling with that. And he says, I must admit that all ultimate questions cannot have final answers, but that we can at least be aware of the problem we have presented. I have touched the limits of my understanding and must stop here. The tree of knowledge again and again tempts one at the cost of neglecting the most important tree, the tree of life. How can human thinking grasp the destiny of life itself when we are not its owners? Now, what I'm doing, Ruby, in Riders in the Storm, is I'm looking at climate change and the various proposals, geoengineering and heat pumps and corporate responsibility, the whole lot. I'm looking at it and saying, well, basically, none of it's enough. But we must not be tempted by the tree of knowledge. We must not be tempted to think that we're the ones who can work it all out. Our calling, folks, our calling as spiritual activists, and by the way, that's, where am I? Oops. Knocking everything down here. That's a book that Matt Carmichael and I wrote on spiritual activism. Our calling is to seek that which gives life. Our calling is first and foremost to the tree of life, which also grew in the mythological garden. And so in the latter chapters of Riders in the Storm, I tell a potted version of what I've shared with you today. What I've shared with you today is summarized in the latter chapters. And I urge reconnection with community of place, recovering our connection to the land, to one another, and what is so often the missing dynamic or the missing dimension of the spiritual. So much activism is devoid of spirituality or offers only a shallow spirituality. And so in Riders in the Storm, I go very deeply into the nature of nonviolence. I'm indebted to a conversation I had with Ruby's sister, Christabel, who did her thesis on the Bhagavad Gita, and the conversations we had about Hinduism and the meaning of Dharma that came out of that. I take it into that territory. And when I am asked to speak to faith groups, as I often am in ministry training or eco-congregation events, that kind of stuff, I always say to the faith groups, look, if you are people of faith, if you are people of connection to a spiritual tradition, whatever that tradition might be, to me, it's all the same if it's founded in love. If you are connected to that, don't just replicate what Friends of the Earth or WWF or Greenpeace are doing. Don't replicate what the secular organizations are doing, but contribute what spirituality can bring. Contribute what that spirituality, profound interconnectedness of membership one of another. Contribute that in a very real way, because when you ask the question, why is it, if this is my conscious ego and that's Ruby's conscious ego and there's Umberto's and there's Pablo's and there's Suzanne's, and if we're all looking across at each other as separate atomized individuals, it makes sense to compete. We start to knock each other out until there's only two left, and then even they knock each other out and you're left with number one. And so what we need is to understand it's not about that kind of competition, it's about mutuality. It's about that cooperation by which we start to see, as I think the Beatles had it, oh no, Pink Floyd, echoes. Strangers passing in the street, by chance two separate passers meet, and I am you, and what I see is me. And will you take me through by the hand and lead me through the land and help me understand? I forget how the rest of it goes. So beautiful. On the Medal album of Pink Floyd, the track echoes, strangers passing on the street. By chance, two separate passers meet, and I am you, and what I see is me. We're all Buddha nature. We're all jewels in the net of Indra. We're all branches on the vine of life of John 15 in the Gospels. If you're going to read the Gospels, don't try going for the whole Bible, but you'll get one of these little single edition. That's Luke's Gospel. It's a good starting point. And just give it a second look. Second look, that's not meant to be a pun, but he can serve us one to remind you. The Gita, you know, I suggested Juan Mascaro's Penguin Classics one. So Ruby, your question is, that's why, you know, how do we do it? I think we do it in those ways, and then we create context where these things can happen, context of meaning. Sharing food, I talked about the mussel feast with the Papuans, sharing food together. And, you know, folks, the biggest thing will be your own bearing, your own presence. The question, you know, are you doing what you're doing from that place of prayer, by which I mean immersion in being? I don't mean a form of words. I don't mean a formula. I don't mean our prayer. Panikkadji's manuscript again, with all, look at all the scribbles on it. Let me begin with prayer. That is becoming conscious of our sense of precariousness, not for ourselves. None of us has a solution to the world we tackle. None of us can offer. This is so trippy, folks, because, you know, I didn't rehearse using this. This is on my desk because it was given to me just recently, and it's so relevant. None of us can offer a convincing program of action. At the very least, the word prayer suggests being conscious of our precariousness when we deal with such major issues. But we need to become aware not only the sense of our precariousness, but also of the precariousness of the situation where we live. The precariousness of this moment, which is our moment in time and history. So a lot of you, especially if you're a younger generation than me, you'll be saying, how come, you know, we got born into such a shit time in history, banged up with coronavirus, the world becoming a worse and worse. At least somebody like me, you know, I was a child in the 60s. When we are stardust, we are golden, we've got to make it back to the garden. I think it's so much harder for the younger generation now. But here's Panikkadji, literally down there, 1 mile, that's our garden. Well, I better not show you, we might have the underwear hanging out in the line, but is that sure? Yeah, there we go. You see an industrial premises at the back there. I can't see, and then a Victorian school there. Just over there, beyond that school, is where Panikkadji said those words when we had him here in 1990. And he's saying, be aware of the precariousness of this moment, which is our moment, which is our moment in time and history. And so, you know, it seems to me God doesn't need any more angels up in hell. There's plenty of angels enough playing harps up in heaven, beg your pardon. There's plenty of angels enough playing harps up in heaven. God needs people in service, spiritual activism, leadership as service in the spaces that are hell. And so if your activism is spiritual activism, rejoice in these times. because your life will not be wasted. Your life will not be caught up in trivialities and superficialities. We have the opportunity to carry out activism of meaning.
Thank you, Alastair. Aviva has a question about how we coordinate all of that. Aviva, would you like to word that yourself, or shall I? I can't see where you are. If you want to word it, you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can read it out.
Yeah, thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you so much. Very inspiring, especially about the I'm of Eigg. So what I see us all doing is reinventing wheels. And although I agree about the importance of the spiritual, it seems like we are already very effectively as fragmented as all our forests and other habitat systems. So how could you foresee pulling us all together or finding ways for us all to coordinate so that we can fight the kind of ecocide we're seeing on the planet?
I can only repeat that we are not God. None of us here is God, but we are the hands and legs of God. We are the hands and legs of the divine principle. And so each one of us, in the context of our lives, takes the material that we've got and works with it. I mean, in my life, I have just a very small impact. I do what I can. I do what I can. And if I think that I have to come up with a master plan or the solution, the fix, I'm entering into a kind of hubris. I'm becoming attached to something that is actually beyond my powers. And that's the definition of hubris. That's ego writ large. So I would say, let us just be faithful to the ground on which we walk. The story is told of the woman who brought the precious oil, a very beautiful oil called nard. I have a bottle of it in my bag over there, nard or spikenard. And I use it in workshops. If we were live, I would go around just now and I would put a drop of this oil on each of your hands and invite you to do what Bill Clinton never did and inhale. And it's a oil that is used. It's an oil that is used or was used in funerary arrangements and in sacred tasks. And the story, it's given in Luke's gospel that I held up there, is that a poor woman came to Jesus and she had spent a year's wages on buying this pot of nard, this precious perfume. And she broke it so that the fragrance filled the house. And I try to avoid using the word Pharisees because that apparently is disrespectful to Jewish people in that tradition. So shall we just say that the religious authorities who were with him were furious at this and said, look at her, she's wasting all that money on that pot of perfume. And Jesus said, she has done what she did to prepare me for my death. She did what little she could. She did what little she could. And so the importance of just taking every next step. In Riders in the Storm, I talk about big things as well. I talk about world population, which is an unpopular thing to talk about, and how all the studies show that when women are free and when you have social justice, the fertility rate starts falling radically without any need for population control. That's not a very popular agenda on the right, that women's emancipation and social justice will reduce population, but it's how it works out. And then you combine that with reducing consumerism. So in my lifetime, born in 55, world population has gone up 3 times, but our level of carbon emissions from our consumption has gone up 6 times. So in my lifetime, consumption is twice as bad as population, if you want to put it that way. But if we can replace consumerism with appreciation of what really matters in life. I mean, Varen and I, we do drive a car, we do use a car in our lives, but it's a fairly battered old second-hand car. And we chuckle, you know, we drive up at places where we'll be giving a keynote speech or something, and there'll be all these posh cars. I'm going to be speaking to a gathering of the International Rotary Clubs in Australia, and I'm just visioning, you know, driving up into the hotel car park, and there'll be all these Volvos and Jaguars, and I'll be in a beat-up 10-year-old Vauxhall Corsa, and I'm there to give the after-dinner speech. Oh, it'll be beautiful. But I'll also be telling them it was Rotary International that helped us to build that school in Papua New Guinea, and I'll be telling that story. So I'll be trying to always to make those connections. So, you know, I'm sorry, I can't really give you the master plan. I can only say, like the woman with the oil, do what you can. Do what you can. Like the widow with the mite. The widow was just a penny that she was able to put into the collection box. Give what you can, but don't try to get ahead of yourself. Ram Dass, you know, that wonderful American spiritual teacher. My mother died in January, and as she was dying, I was reading his book about death and dying, walking each other home. Beautiful, you know, guy who came out of a Jewish tradition, and he's he adopted. He gets his Jewish Hindu with a lot of Christianity mix in Ram Dass. As those of you who will know his work, I'm sure many of you do, will be aware. And Ram Dass says, you know, that the ego always tries to get ahead of itself. The ego is always trying to be ahead of itself, and then you trip up over it. We trip up over our own shadow, trying to take on more than we can do. Remember that old pop song? Was it Slim Whitman or somebody? Do what you do well. Do what you do well, da, 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 do. Oh, I better shut up. My wife will come and silence me. She always tells me I've not to sing on these things, but I don't do myself any credit. But do what you do well. And I cannot offer any better than that. And the rest of it, folks, you know, it's like Vimando Panika says, how can we try to control being when, I forget how he put it better than I remembered, but we are not the architects of being. Our task is to be humble. And your spiritual activism, it calls for boldness. It calls for real courage at times. And some of you will be working in parts of the world where that courage can be very costly indeed. The worst I had was I lost my teaching job at Edinburgh University, tied in with my work in land reform in 1996. They later kind of made it up. They made me an honorary fellow for a while in the School of Divinity, but it was very, very painful time. I felt like I was being hacked apart and my work was being destroyed, which it was. How did I get onto that?
Thank you, Alastair. We've been 2.5 hours. So thank you so much for your focus and immense generosity, sharing your story and your insights and your perspectives and different understanding of so much of what we've been exploring in Guardians of the Forest as a whole, as the course. It's been really perfect to end here with you today to really unpick that relationship between action and thoughts, culture, spirituality, how we relate to one another within our societies, to ourselves, to our land, how that all comes together. So often they get separated and we can feel isolated or unable to create change. So thank you so much for really bringing it all together as we finish. I wonder if anyone would like to share anything before we finish. Now's the chance. You can unmute or write. Lots of people writing. Yes, so thank you, everyone. Peter says, Michael Mead says, it's not your job to see the world, do what your soul calls you to do. And I think, Alastair, your talk definitely brought that home, to follow the soul, and we all know what needs to happen, and we have to have the courage to do it. So thank you. We'll share the recording on the Mighty Networks platform. I'll stop it.